Good evening, church family. What a blessing to have you in our evening service tonight. We're looking forward to being together again on Sunday evening sometime soon. Of course, the last Sunday in this month, we will be together in a Sunday evening service as we rejoice in the ordination of George Binoka. And so he's going to be going as a missionary from our church to Kenya, George and Lexi. And we're planning an ordination council and then an ordination service on August 30th. Now, of course, we're presuming that he passes the ordination council. So presuming he passes the ordination council, he will be ordained. And they're going to be leaving for Kenya sometime this fall. So plan to be with us in our evening service on August 30th. We won't have a recording for that evening. Lord willing, we'll live stream that evening. But plan to be with us in the evening service. And then we will be getting back to the evening service. I know it's easy to get relaxed and enjoy sitting home on Sunday night and coming to church. But it is important for us to gather again on Sunday night. It's important for not only our ministry to one another, but our ministry to the outside world. There are people that come to church on Sunday night. I know that there are folks in our church that have gotten saved in Sunday night services. And so that's near and dear to them. And so do plan on coming back. Don't plan on making this something permanent. I know that some of you have been home because of concerns about COVID, concerns about sickness, especially if you're in an at-risk group. We certainly understand that, and we certainly support you in that. That's why we're doing these services like this, so you can have that option. But do make sure that you're planning to come back at some point in the future. There was a survey that was done in Singapore that said that about 15% of the Singaporean believers like the online services so much they're not planning to attend church again, ever. And that's a bad choice. This is no substitute for gathering together in person. So let's turn in our Bibles this evening to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 14. 2 Samuel chapter 14, actually we're going to be in the book of in 2 Samuel 13, we come to the death of Amnon, and that's where we're going to start. Now, you remember Amnon was the son of David, who raped his sister Tamar, and then Absalom conspired to kill Amnon for what he had done to his full sister Tamar. And so that happened at the end of chapter 13, and that's where we're starting. The servants of Absalom have just killed Amnon, and the rest of the king's sons who are gathered together at the same dinner, they jump up and they run away thinking that all of their lives are in danger. And so that's where we'll start in verse 29 of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 29. And the servants of Absalom did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, every man gat him upon his mule, and fled. And it came to pass, while they were in the way, that tidings came to David, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. Then the king arose, and tare his garments, and lay on the earth, and all the servants stood by with their clothes rent. And Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon only is dead, for by the appointment of Absalom this hath been determined, from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now I want you to notice something. Remember Amnon had a friend? Remember the friend's name? The friend's name was Jonadab. It's now Jonadab who is in the presence of King David. And when King David thinks that all of his sons had been murdered by his one son Absalom, it's Jonadab who says, Oh no, that's not the case, king. It's only Amnon. And Absalom had determined that from the day that Amnon forced his sister Tamar. You know what that indicates? That indicates that Jonadab knew what Absalom was going to do to Amnon before he did it. So much for your friends. Your friends who get you to sin will just as quickly conspire against you. And that's what Jonadab does here. Well, the king gets up. He says, Now therefore let my lord king take this thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead. But Absalom fled, the young man, and the young man that kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said unto the king, Behold, the king's sons come. As thy servant said, so it is. And it came to pass, as soon as As soon as he had made an end of speaking, behold, the king's sons came, and lifted up their voice, and wept. And the king also, and all of his servants wept very sore. But Absalom fled, and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. Geshur is a city that was to the north, and mostly to the east of the Sea of Galilee, in the area that we would call the Golan Heights today. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing that he was dead. Now, I skipped a verse there, verse 37. It says, But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, and David mourned for his son every day. You know what's ambiguous in the text there? It's ambiguous whether he's mourning for Amnon or whether he's mourning for Absalom. It almost reads like he was mourning for Absalom as much as, or maybe even instead of, Amnon. What we have here is the beginning, but not just the beginning. This is the continuation of a fractured relationship between David and Absalom. And we can learn some things from the life of David, because David commits some mistakes. I mean, David commits some terrible errors in his parenting here. Now, David was far from being a perfect human being. In fact, there are major failures in David's life, and this is one of them. And so we want to learn from the errors of others. So let's take a look at the life of David and look at some of the errors in his parenting so that we might not do the same things. Now, when we look at David and somebody like this in the Old Testament, and we don't see an evaluation of his life in the text, it is up to us to discern the text based upon biblical principles. Now, these things are in the text for us to learn and to see. And the errors of these Old Testament characters are often, they're plain, they're open. They are not hidden in the text. They're open in the text. And so we want to take a look at the life of David here. And especially the idea of being a paralyzed parent. And so I want to talk about the dangers of paralyzed parenting. Have you ever been in that situation as a parent where either you don't know what you should do, and so you do nothing, or you know what you should do, but you don't want to do it, so you do nothing, or you feel awkward about the thing that you're supposed to do, or you make excuses about the thing that you are supposed to do, or you are afraid of what you're supposed to do and what your children might think about you, or what your family might think about you, or what others might think about you, and you become frozen, paralyzed as a parent. There are great dangers in this, and the dangers can reap a terrible harvest in the life of your children. And so this is what we see with David. We see a paralyzed parent. And so let's take a look at David's life here. Now, before we start, there are some important things that I want us to understand. Bad parenting does not excuse sin. We often see the story of some rebellious young lady, and people will say she has daddy issues, or a rebellious young man, and they have parent issues. And oftentimes, you can trace back the sins of a rebellious young people to the negligent or erroneous or sometimes even abusive parenting, abusive practices of their parents. But that doesn't make an excuse. That's not an excuse for sinning in the present. Yes, we might have had it bad. Yes, this might have had an impact upon us. But we still have choices in the future with regard to how we behave. Many fine people, great people, have come out of horrible homes. And so understand that we cannot justify or excuse sin because of bad parenting. But also, we have to remember that bad parenting does carry responsibility. We do have influence. It's hard for us to grasp this, that there is influence to the good and there is influence to the evil. But still the child makes a choice. But to call that influence hard and fast, immovable, is wrong also. And we can err in that in two ways. We can say a bad parent will inevitably produce a bad child. Well, that excuses the child's sin. We can also say a good parent inevitably produces a good child, but that isn't necessarily the case either. You can have an almost perfect parent. Nobody does have a perfect parent, but you can have, for all practical reasons, the best of human parents and still choose to sin and make shipwreck of your life. I can use myself as an example here. I grew up in a wonderful Christian home. I had great godly examples of parents. They're not perfect, but they were certainly as close to perfect as I've ever seen. My parents are kind, godly, consistent in their Christian testimony, gave me the best of spiritual training, lived it out in their own lives from the earliest time I can remember. We had family devotions around the table. We prayed together. We sang together. We discussed spiritual things together. We went through very difficult times together. And yet, even at this moment in life, I can turn from obedience to the Lord and go into sin. To deny me that possibility is to deny my free will before God. Our righteousness in this life is not inevitable. There's nothing we can do in our own lives to make it inevitable. We have to make choices day by day, and there's nothing that another person can do that will make it inevitable. Before we begin, we need to understand these things. We also need to understand parents who are in positions of authority. In this particular case, David is the king in Israel. And because he's the king, his parenting is on display before everyone. Now, that is a formula for disaster. And we need to understand some of the disasters that can occur. One disaster is the tendency to want to cover sin because of the position that you're in. A pastor who is leading a local church has children who are sinners. I don't know if you know this, but pastors' kids, PKs as they are often called, are sinners. I can't cover the sin of my own children. To do that is to do damage to the cause of Christ, to do damage to the body of Christ over which I serve and over which I have responsibility, but it also does damage to my own children. This is especially when our children are in the home. So that can be damaging, which means that there's a level of openness. I've experienced this in my own life. I've had to be very open with church leadership about various issues that go on in my own family. I have to do that. And so covering sin is a danger, but also being overly harsh can lead to bitterness. I remember talking with a pastor one time, and he was talking about holding his children to a higher responsibility or making things harder for them than for the other kids that were in the youth group. And I told him he can't do that. When his child is in the youth group, he has to treat them just like the other children. He can't make the standards harder for scripture scholarship or are the standards harder for getting to camp or the standards harder for, any of those things. You can't do that because the children will understand that. If I parent harshly because of my fear of others or because of the way I want that to be perceived by others, my children will perceive that. And my children can easily become bitter. And so there's a danger of being too soft or too hard based upon my position. What I have to do is the right thing, regardless of what my job is, or regardless of what others think. I can't even parent out of fear of what might happen down the road. I have to parent appropriately for the moment. This is really important. David was in this type of circumstance, and I think his position as king also had impact upon his parenting. And so let's continue on as we consider just some basic principles of paralyzed parenting. One of the ways that we become paralyzed parents is simply becoming permissive parents. Now, what do we mean by that? We refuse to take appropriate disciplinary action. In the case here, we see, we saw this at the end of last week's message, that David did not take appropriate action with regard to Amnon. Amnon raped his sister Tamar. David knew about it. David didn't want to deal with it. David got angry about it. Permissive parents do get angry at their children. Permissive parents get frustrated at their children. Permissive parents sometimes yell at their children, but they don't hold their children responsible. They yell, they scream, they get angry, and then they go on, and the child continues on doing the same thing. There are times that parents think that the yelling, the screaming, and the anger should be enough to make the child, to correct the child. But it's not going to be enough to correct the child. And in this case, there were responsibilities. Imagine with me for a moment that you are a parent who is a teacher, and you have a child in your class that is your own flesh and blood child, and that child cheats on a test. And so all the other students know that they cheated on the test. When the child gets home, you scream and yell and get angry, and it's miserable. But there are no consequences. You say, well, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to get angry. I'm going to give them a tongue lashing. Tongue lashings only lead to bitterness. And so the child continues on in the class with no consequences. Now, what have you done for that child? Well, first of all, you have the testimony before the class is that you're a hypocrite. That you will not hold your own child responsible, and therefore they are not responsible either. They'll get bitter, they'll get angry, they see you as a hypocrite. The second thing that happens is you open your child up to peer consequences, because the peers perceive your child as being a favorite and having privileges and getting out of consequences because they're flesh and blood child. They will begin to take it out on your child. And they can do it in the cruelest of ways among peers. Meanness, anger. You see, that's exactly the type of thing that is happening here. Because David failed to demonstrate any kind of consequences for Amnon. And the consequences really should have been great. Absalom takes those matters into his own hands. That's the permissive parent here. Now, why was David a permissive parent? Well, oftentimes parents are permissive because they see in their own children themselves. You look at your child, and your child looks like you did when you were that age. And your child is behaving like you did at that age. And you feel guilty about the things that you did. And because you feel guilty about the things that you did, you feel like you're a hypocrite in holding your child responsible to a behavior that you did not follow when you were at the same age. But the standard here, though, isn't your own life. Your own behavior should not be the standard for your children. Biblical expectations should be the standard for your children. That's the problem. You don't have that clear. That doesn't make sense to you. So you're unwilling to hold your children to biblical standards. And so because of guilt or because of a misunderstanding, so we can become a permissive parent because of guilt. I think that's what happened here with David. He saw himself as the standard. He didn't measure up to the standard. How can he possibly expect anybody else to measure up to the standard? But when we all acknowledge that the Word of God is the standard, and we all acknowledge that we fail sometimes with the standard, and that we all have consequences based upon the standard, then we can hold one another accountable even though we fail. Now, one of the other reasons that parents are permissive is because of laziness. I don't know if I see this in the life of David, but there is this sense of, I just don't want to bother. It's too much work to hold my child accountable. I've got to follow him around, especially a child where you've really let it get away from you. And you know what I'm talking about. You've let them get away with what they're doing for many, many years, and they scream and they yell, and it's too much work to try to get them back in line. And so you're just too lazy to be an effective parent. And that laziness, remember, because it's laziness and permissiveness, it spoils the child. It subjects the child to consequences, harsh consequences by others in their lives. You say, well, I want to be too kind. I want to be nice to my child. I just can't bear to hear them cry. I just can't bear to see them angry. Well, what about when they can't hold a job later on? What about when their finances are in disarray? What about when their marriage falls apart? This isn't about your love for your child. This is about laziness, and you're making love as an excuse. You're using love as an excuse. That's permissive parenting. Now, sometimes it's not just permissive parenting. Sometimes it's fear. Fear. Well, fear of what? Fear of how my child might respond. Fear that my child will hate me. Moms and dads, there have been many, many, many children who've looked at their parents in a fit of anger and said, "I hate you." And that wound goes deep into a parent's soul. I understand it. But we have to be willing to endure the anger of our children in order to show the greatest love for them. Those same children, when parents endure, often come back and wrap their arms around mom and dad and tell them they love them and thank you. And so, moms and dads, do the right thing. The right thing is always the most loving thing from your child. Don't let fear paralyze you. The permissive parent. There are all these reasons, because of guilt, because of laziness, because of fear. But what happens is responsibilities missed, and the responsibilities missed are to the child and others. I don't think Amnon's fate was any better because David failed to deal with Amnon's sin. Now, maybe under the law, Amnon deserved to die. Maybe there could have been some other punishment under the law. Maybe there had been some sort of resolution under the law. But the fact is that Amnon ended up dead, and Absalom fled. So David's failure to deal with Amnon's sin still compounded the problem and made all of the other king's sons feel like they were on their way to dying too. David's failure to deal with his son's sin led to a kingdom crisis, such that David's most faithful servants stepped in and tried to help resolve the issue. This is the danger of a permissive parent. It not only affects you, it affects your children, and affects all those around them. The next one is the passive parent. David not only demonstrates he's permissive, but he's passive. You say, what's the difference between permissive and passive? Well, the permissive parent is often very interactive with the child. The passive parent, they just back off. This is a non-relational parent. This is the dad who never says, "I love you." Dads need to communicate with their children. Now, that communication might not be long. You might not have to preach and talk for hours and hours, but it needs to be timely, it needs to be clear, and you need to listen to them. And David allows his failure with Amnon to destroy his relationship with Absalom. Let's continue on. Let's take a look. So he neglects to take initiative. He allows the child to live in uncertainty. What Absalom does now is he flees to Geshur. Now, Geshur, most likely, we don't know for sure, is probably a stronghold city to the east of the Sea of Galilee in what we would call the Golan Heights today. And he goes there and he flees to another king's encampment, another king's castle, and he stays there. Now, what's going on? Well, this was a common practice in ancient Israel. In fact, we can trace this practice at least back to the early time of the kingdom and the Levitical law, when you had the role of a avenger of blood and the cities of refuge. What Absalom is doing here is it's like running to a city of refuge. Now think about this for a moment. If Absalom is running like he's running from an avenger of blood to a city of refuge, who would have been the avenger of blood? Well, that would have been David. So Absalom murders Amnon, and now Absalom runs, and David would be the avenger of blood, and it would have been expected for David to go kill Absalom. So there Absalom is, in a virtual prison. He can't leave. No word from his father. But usually, the avenger of blood was somebody unrelated. Usually the avenger of blood was not your own blood father. And it says here, the last verse of chapter 13, that David longed to go forth unto Absalom. This was in his heart. He knew it was something he should do, but he didn't. We sometimes think that this is justice. When somebody does something that we consider sin against them, we give them the silent treatment. Husbands do it to wives, wives do it to husbands, parents do it to children. We just give them the cold shoulder. We allow them to squirm. We allow them to live in uncertainty. And this is not a biblical process. The biblical process says, according to Matthew chapter 18, that the two people are supposed to get together and hash it out, to talk about it, to come to a just and biblical conclusion. That's the way the Bible tells us to deal with conflict between brothers, with sin between brothers. Not to just leave people in uncertainty. Now, we try to do even sometimes these unsaid but said acts of forgiveness. And that also leaves uncertainty. When there's conflict between brothers and one has sinned against another, they need to come to that point where you say, I have sinned, will you forgive me? Here is my sin. I did this, I did this, I did this. Will you forgive me? And the answer from the other person is, oh, it's no big deal. It's okay. It's not okay. It's no big deal. The proper answer to that is, I forgive you. I no longer hold this to your charge. And David could have done that with Absalom. Certainly, the crime of Amnon deserved death. Absalom carried out the sentence. David could have looked at Absalom and said, you should not have done that, but you carried out the crime. You carried out the sentence that I should have carried out as king. That was my fault. What you did was wrong, but because of my fault, I forgive you. He could have done that. He could have made it very clear, but David did not do that. He allowed his child to live in uncertainty. Parents, your children shouldn't be uncertain about your heart toward them. Now, the relationship might be damaged. They might be in sin. They might be living in consequences of that sin. But they should never be unclear about what the relationship is between you. Let's continue. It allows the child to live in uncertainty. By the way, when this happens, everybody else is in uncertainty too. Joab, who is David's chief of staff, Joab is concerned about this, and so Joab hires this woman. He went and he fetched a wise woman. He said unto her, I pray thee, feign thyself as a mourner. He says, feign yourself as a mourner, and you go tell David the story about your two sons and how they were out in the field, and they fought, one killed the other, and now, because one has killed the other, everybody wants to murder or wants to execute the son who killed the other son, and if that happens, then you'll have no one left. And it is interesting how these stories, these people, this is how they seem to get through to David by taking David's eyes off of himself and making him look at someone else. David seemed to be able to see injustice outside of his own life, but failed to see it in his own life. So when Nathan the prophet comes and tells the story about the two families with the lamb, David gets that. And when Joab sends the woman of Tekoa and she speaks to the king, and he gets it, and he says he's going to protect that other son. And then David realizes that, Joab has put him up to this. He realizes and sees his error, but how long has he left his son with uncertainty? And you see Joab going to such extremes to try to get through to the king that something has to be done here, because it seems that the people loved Absalom. And there were things to like about Absalom, but I wonder what happened in Absalom's heart in those months, in those years, in which he was separated from the king. So they hear the story. David hears the story. His heart is touched. You can read that at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 14. And he finds that it's Joab that has said this. So David relents and he sends messengers, and Absalom returns to Jerusalem. But here's what happens when Absalom returns to Jerusalem. It says here that he came to Jerusalem, and David said he can come, he can return into his house, but he can't see my face. And Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem, and everybody loved Absalom. Everybody thought Absalom was great. He was good looking, he was charismatic, everybody loved him. But all Absalom cared about was the approval of his father. And for 2 years, he had the adoration of everybody in Jerusalem. He lived in his house in Jerusalem. He had freedom, but he didn't have the approval of his father, and he was bitter. Can I just remind you, moms and dads, what you think about your children matters to them. And the unkind and the vicious and the demeaning words that you speak to them, they don't soon forget. The neglect, they don't soon forget. Mom matters. Dad matters. David became a passive parent. And I think David thought, well, this passive parenting is sort of his form of punishment. But it did nothing for the spiritual condition of Absalom. It did nothing for justice with regard to Absalom. And it did nothing for the kingdom. Everyone else lives in uncertainty. David refused to take initiative. In fact, every step along the way in dealing with Amnon or Absalom had to be initiated by someone else. Someone else had to convince David to do it or take the step for him. David was a passive parent. He was unwilling to communicate, unwilling to talk. And because he was unwilling to communicate, there's more to it than this. His actions taken were incomplete. For instance, David sent a messenger to get Absalom from Geshur, and he comes to Jerusalem, but there's no restoration of relationship. God does not do that with it. Have you noticed that? We can stray from him. We can sin against him, and that sin can damage our relationship. But with our Heavenly Father, there is always a way back into full fellowship, even if there is not a way back into full privileges. David took Absalom back and gave him full privileges except fellowship with his father. It would have been more important and more appropriate for David to take Absalom back and have some sort of life consequences, yet fellowship with the father. This is the issue. We must, as parents, give our children, when they're in sin, a clear path to restoration. They need to understand where restoration and how restoration can be accomplished. Now, they might not choose to take that path, but that path needs to be clear. And God, even though we sin against him, and even though we have sometimes horrible consequences, God still loves us and gives us a path to restoration of fellowship. This is the failure of David, and this is the failure of some parents. How about you? Are you a paralyzed parent? I challenge you to not be. I challenge you to examine your own life, to get together as husband and wife and have a good conversation about how you're doing it. We could help you with that. We do parenting classes here. We can offer good books. We can do counsel. We can provide guidance. It's part of our responsibility in discipleship as church leadership. However we can help, let us know. You may contact us at the church office at 623-581-3115, or you may email us at info@nwvbc.org. How about you? Are you a paralyzed parent? Don't continue. Make changes today. God bless.